Okay. All right, now we're live, I think, officially. Probably.
There's always
Totally
some lag.
Totally gonna work this time.
Okay, it looks like we are live.
All right, now. All right. Everybody mute their YouTube. All right. I think we're here. Hello, chat. Can you hear us? Testing. Mic levels okay? All right. Cool. I don't know who's doing the intro. I kind of got it updated beforehand. You want me to just have it up? Should I do the intro?
If you don't mind.
All right. Cool. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started, guys. I'm saying smart things. I think chat's ready to go. Ready for some PHP. 1 second. I gotta find the right thing. Okay, like that, and then find this thing. Share the right window. All right, here we go, and we're off. Thank you all for joining us. February 2023. Yep, MergePHP. We are a collection of PHP user groups. I think there's officially now 10 different user groups from the US, mostly from the US and Canada. Here's the list. We typically go through these intro slides and kind of do announcements before we get started. And we have our speakers here, so we're ready to go. So I'll try to go through these slides here real quick and mention everything. So right off the bat, if you've ever been here before, we raffle off a one, maybe sometimes two licenses for JetBrains products. I think everybody knows and loves PHP Storm, JetBrains, DataGrip, and WebStorm is also great if you already have PHP Storm. First one to officially email Chris gets our JetBrains license for the month. So you made it. You're here. Email Chris. And
if we
also
have two for the month, we'll give away two, but if not, we'll go to the first person.
Yep. So while you're emailing Chris, Alana PHP. Really appreciate Chris and Atlanta PHP. So welcome everybody from Atlanta. There's some links to check out Atlanta PHP. They have a video archive. Some of the old merge videos are on the Atlanta PHP video archive. So definitely check out Atlanta. Austin, that's me. Yep. So we do a PHP conference here in Austin. We've done it for 3 years now, and Ian helps out with the 4 years. My bad. Ian helps out with the user group as well as running the conference. And you can find out some more information about PHP chat and join us on Discord and Slack. There's a couple different places you can connect with us, and there's other groups there as well, kind of like consolidated a little bit in the PHP community stuff. I think there's a conference slide, so Ian, I'll throw it over to you if you have any conference announcements in just a bit.
Sure.
Boston PHP. So I think they're currently our biggest PHP user group. It's run by Bobby Cahill. And they do 3 different types of events every month, and there's a virtual self-study group run by Mr. Gene Babin. You can find out more information about Gene on webapprentices.org there. But all the virtual self-study stuff is done and run through the Meetup Boston PHP site, and they do a new studies cohort about once a quarter. So if you're interested in learning more information, or upskilling yourself, basically learning some new things, check out Boston PHP. Seattle PHP, that's Tim. So Seattle Tim helps out with our social media, and we're working on a website. More announcements coming, TBD, coming soon. And welcome everybody from Seattle joining us. Vancouver, I think they've shown up before. That is run by James and Sean. Welcome everybody from Vancouver. Vegas, so that's run by Josh, OG programmer, and they do PHP and PHP adjacent stuff as well in person. If you're in the Vegas area, check out Vegas PHP, Vegas programmers on Meetup.
Yeah, and quick note there, we also have a Symphony Cast membership to give away for 1 month free, and also a JetBrains license to give out. So in the YouTube chat, I'm going to drop my email. First person to email me will have their choice, and the second person gets whatever's left.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh, and thanks to Remote Dev Force for sponsoring MergePHP. KC PHP, yes, that's Eric, Dan, and John. They have a couple in-person events. I think they got started like many of us, doing the coffee shop stuff, and still going strong with the coffee shop meetups. If you're in the Kansas City area, Missouri area, there, check out KC PHP, and they're on Meetup there. Utah, that's Mark and Derek. I think they're both here, and they're more of a recent to join us here. So I don't know a lot of facts about Utah, but we're glad to have them. So thanks to Mark and Derek for helping out. San Diego PHP. Another recent addition. Oops, this link is wrong. I have a couple housekeeping announcements, but the short URL links have all changed. But I'll talk about that in a sec. The San Diego PHP has sdphp.org, and they are putting on part of PHP Tech. So there's a discount code for tech. This link is wrong. I'll send out the updated link here in a bit in YouTube chat. All right. Didn't get this slide updated, but it's close enough to January/February. So just as a reminder, you shouldn't be on 7.4 anymore or later. This is kind of like our slide of shame for some of us, but we like to just remind everybody to keep your PHP versions up to date. All right, so upcoming conferences, PHP UK coming soon. And I think some of our organizers are flying out to that. Confu later this month. PHP Tech I already mentioned. PHP Day in May. International PHP Conference in Berlin, LaraCon, always fun, and Longhorn happening in November. Ian, if you want to tell us a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this will be our 5th year of Longhorn PHP. Exact dates TBD. My guess is will be last weekend in October or first weekend in November here in Austin. Stay tuned, sign up for our email list, and the next email you get from there is going to be conference announcement of when and where we will be holding it.
Awesome. Thanks for the update. Yeah, so just follow us on all the social medias, but definitely follow us, like and subscribe on YouTube. Hit the little ding the bell, so you be notified about events. That definitely helps us out, and make sure that you're aware of what's happening. But we switched from using last year, switched over from using Zoom to make it easier on everybody, and so now we're just doing the YouTube live streams. So definitely check us out on YouTube. Some more social media information that needs to be updated there. Short URLs. And all right, I guess before we get into the speaker stuff, the short URLs, we have a new domain, and it's mphp.io. So we're just a little bit behind on updating links to stuff. So my apologies on if some of the short URLs are not working for you. We'll get it updated in all the places soon. Hopefully, by next month, I think everything will be updated. So thank you for joining us. All right, we're here. Chris I was updating this minutes before the talk. So, typical speaker, you're working on the slides last minute. Oh, I'm ready. That happens for meetup organizers as well. So I did get the slide updated. So Chris, talking about Docker, I hope you're here to learn more about containers. It is definitely a useful skill to have, whether you're not, even if you're not using containers currently. I think this is something that is helpful to know and understand, because you probably will be using containers at some point in your career. And I'm sure I will learn something. There's got to be some good takeaways, even if you're an expert. Chris is a very knowledgeable person, so he's going to do a really good job tonight. I know it. So thank you so much for joining us. Chris, I hope you're ready. I'm about ready to throw it to you, man.
Yep, I'm all set. So let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. Yes, I'll steal screen sharing. Share. And
All
hopefully
right.
that should be up for everybody.
Yep, I can see it.
Awesome.
Working.
Okay. So thank you very much. Yeah, so ironically, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Docker today, because the whole point is Docker's dead. The kind of nice thing is, like Logan kind of mentioned, we're moving in this direction where containers are becoming a normal kind of facet of how we do everything. So we've started with this idea that, Docker is kind of there. That's probably everyone's first introduction to Docker. I know when I started playing around with things many, many years ago, before Docker was even actually a company, there was this idea that as people put these things out, Docker ended up being kind of this driving force for a change in a lot of different things. And at this point in 2023, when we're now talking about this, Docker is a whole lot of things. Ironically, it's not just containers. So when you say Docker, you have to actually be really careful about what exactly are you talking about, because they've built up an entire ecosystem around everything that they do. Generally, we'll summarize everything down into what they call the Docker engine, which is that kind of piece that you play with kind of day to day. And ironically, one thing that's not on here is the Docker desktop, the tool they came out with, a handful of years earlier that allowed all of these things to work nicely on Windows and Mac OS. But weirdly enough, not Linux, which is where all of this kind of stuff started. I'm not even sure if there's a Docker desktop for Linux. But if you're on Linux, you probably don't want Docker desktop anyway. But a lot of things are grown out of it. They've come out with, or actually took over a company or a project called Fig years ago and turned that into Docker Compose, which brought in this idea of orchestration, because as it turns out, the way Docker works, you need many containers to run applications. So years and years ago, there was a project called Fig, which has nothing to do with PHP Fig, and turn that into Docker Compose. Now we can bring up containers all together and keeping track of all of those things. But as many people quickly figured out, you can't run any of these things on anything but Linux. So you end up with Docker Machine, which is a virtualization and machine provisioning thing, because under the hood, we're all just actually using Linux. It's, inside Mac OS, there's a small little hypervisor layer. We're running a Linux virtual machine. On Windows, most people are running inside of a Linux virtual machine inside Hyper-V. And a lot of that stuff has now changed to actually now use like the WSL underpinnings that Windows now ships with. Oddly enough, you can actually run native Windows containers. Not very many people do. I actually don't know of anybody who does it in practice or even like in production levels, but you can technically do it. But Docker is turned into this whole suite of solutions for kind of no matter what you need to do. But over time, people realized that this is actually all kind of like just containers, and a kind of foundation worked up around this called the Open Container Initiative. And Docker kind of fostered and started a move toward this. So now a lot of these things are actually handled by the Open Container Initiative group, which handles a plethora of things that Docker actually has no control over directly anymore. So the idea behind the Open Container Initiative is taking all of those things that Docker has done and has kind of shown that are useful and that we've all kind of agreed on are kind of now common practices between, using containers in development, how we should actually deploy these, how we should package these, how tools should actually work together. There's now kind of an open way of doing this, because a lot of the reasons that I'm going to kind of go on record saying Docker is dead and it's dying, because we've kind of now shifted from using Docker to using containers as a much more general idea. So the whole point of that is we don't necessarily actually need Docker anymore. We just need containers, and we need technologies around containers, because it turns out that general idea is really, really, really useful. So I'm not going to go into a real big deep dive on exactly what a container is. If you would love to know exactly how all of this stuff works, Larry Garfield has an excellent talk. I'll post these slides, and I've linked to his a talk that he gave at Jakarta Tech. If you Google for the container is a lie, you'll actually be able to find the video as well. But suffice to say, containers are basically just a set of technologies that already existed. And these systems and these configurations basically just restrict what individual processes can see inside the system, using things built into the Linux kernel that have been there for years, and even things that don't even exist in the kernel. There's other ways of doing it. You can actually kind of shift the focus of what a individual process or series of processes can actually see. And instead of saying like, look at the global user lib directory for files you need, you can say, actually, why don't you go look over here and pretend that that's what that is. There's network available on the system. Instead of using the actual physical device that's plugged into the machine, we've kind of created this other one over off to the side. And there's a lot of magic and stuff that goes along with it. Larry's talk does an excellent, like very deep technical dive into how all that works. So I would recommend definitely checking that out. But all we're doing with a container is kind of just restricting what things can see. And that's all through kind of the way that Linux in and of itself works. And weirdly enough, that's kind of why we run into some of these problems that we have. Like people will ask, why don't we have containers in Mac OS? And the short answer is these things don't really exist in Mac OS. There are ways of doing it, certainly, but the way like Docker works relies on these Linux systems and these Linux configurations. And then because of that, we have to ship VMs, and we end up with slower performance, which arguably is better than it was even a couple of years ago. But you end up in this situation where we're kind of actually just working on a remote machine at the end of the day. Now, the nice thing is there's actually various levels of these. So whenever we usually use like kind of a Docker setup, we're doing single process isolation. And I'm sure anybody who has talked to me, who has listened to me rant about the way some containers are set up, one common thing is, single process per container. And that's actually just kind of an artifact of how Docker itself works. You can actually do full system level isolation. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But it all depends on how and what technologies you're using and the way those systems are constructed. Because like I said, it's actually not just Docker. It's actually kind of surprising when you sit down and talk to somebody, and they talk about this hot new technology of containers as if it's some sort of revolutionary idea. And it turns out these things have existed for a long time when we're talking about computers. One of my first jobs for doing actual like web development and things for a company, we were running our web server in-house because we still do these, and officially like when we were still called webmasters and things like that. We ran our stuff on a free BSD machine, and we ran it inside of a BSD jail. That's kind of a container. We had an HTTPD process walled off from the rest of the operating system. It could only see the things that it knew about. So it only saw the version of PHP that we let it. It only saw the files that we let it see. It didn't actually see anything else or know anything else existed. If you ever played around with like having to reboot a machine and fix things in Linux through like a single user interface, or having to boot from a drive and go into like a CH root, that's kind of a container. We're switching where we're looking and fooling processes into working under these other assumptions. So we have these 8 things that I had just listed off the top of my head. Only one of those things is Docker. There's a whole host of other things out there that take advantage of things. Probably a lot of people, if they've ever hosted over OpenVZ, don't realize that that's actually a system level containerization project that has existed for years. So we actually already kind of live in a world where Docker's not the only option, and has ever actually never been the only option. So there's kind of this present or over-present question of like, well, why did Docker quote unquote win? And there's a really simple reason for that. It actually already happened before Docker was ever even a thing. And I'm really sad that this GIF doesn't actually play. But all Docker did was put lipstick on a pig. That's it. If I could see anybody, I would ask, raise your hand if you've ever heard of Vagrant. We went through this exact same process with Vagrant 12 years ago, a long time ago, where virtualization existed already. These tools were already out there. Vagrant took all of those things and packaged them up into a really nice, easy to use package, and made it nice to be able to set up and consume, and built tooling around it that made it easy to rebuild these virtual machines at different places. So I know one of the earlier jobs I had was part of what my job was maintaining those Vagrant boxes. And the cool thing was we had this ability of build once, we got rid of the it works on my machine problem because we all had the same virtual machines. And I'm sure that everybody's heard that same phrase when it comes to Docker as well. We're getting rid of that it works on my machine, and we have duplicated systems. Production can run on our machine. And that's all Docker really actually did. All of these processes already existed in some way, shape, or form. Now, recent work on them may have increased because of the visibility that Docker has given it, but all Docker did was package up things that were already there. So it won by virtue of having the best user interface. And it's kind of on the losing end now because people have realized that putting a nice user interface on it is a plus, but since it's all kind of a standard technology, especially now with things like the OCI, we don't have to live in just one specific interface. There's things that we can do on top of that. So what I want to look at today is some of these other things that you could actually use that are still containers, that might be Docker adjacent, but can give us a lot more power, and where I think we're kind of going in the world as well. So we have Docker kind of at that low level, and probably the first thing that I would recommend people looking at is a tool called Podman. And I'm being a little bit mean by saying we have Docker at home, and that's what Podman is. Because Podman has actually turned into an incredibly powerful, feature-rich tool, especially over, I would say, probably the last year or so. They're coming out with new things all of the time, and it is pretty much a Docker replacement at this point. They actually bill themselves as being able to just go into your command line and just alias the word Docker to Podman and have everything work, which is a pretty bold claim. And honestly, it's what I use pretty much day to day, even on Mac OS. So Podman in and of itself is a container engine that's maintained by Red Hat, as opposed to Docker in and of itself. So one of the things that came out of the OCI is kind of the standard for how we expect engines to kind of work. And Podman is able to leverage all of those standards developed by OCI, but then kind of basically just co-opted the API interface for Docker and can emulate it. So it's a full container engine that works exactly like how you would expect it to if you're coming from the Docker side. They've even gone so far as to build extra tooling like Podman Compose, which will take a Docker Compose file, which is I don't want to say proprietary because it's kind of all open, but takes a Docker Compose formatted YAML file, and we'll use that to orchestrate all of your stuff and run it through Podman. That tool itself has gotten leagues better in the last couple of years to where you can pretty much use it all by itself. There's very few things that I run into nowadays that don't quite work very well under Podman and Podman Compose. I think the last time I ran into some issues was with Laravel. For whatever reason, the Vite container that comes up works a little bit wonky under Podman. It took a little bit of zhuzhing to actually get to work right. That's not a fault of Laravel or any of the things that they're doing because they're building against Docker. But the cool thing is, like, it actually mostly worked all out of the box to be able to bring that kind of stuff up without having to do a whole lot of work to make it work. So you can actually use this today if you're on Mac OS, Linux, or Windows. If you're on Linux, you can use DNF install Podman and Podman Compose, or apt, depending on your flavor of distribution. If you're using WSL, you could use apt to install it. It's already in the repositories. I actually install that in WSL2 when I'm on Windows, as opposed to going through the whole Docker desktop. And then from there, you pretty much get a full suite of Docker things. So it's really lightweight. It doesn't actually bring in a whole lot of stuff. So the Podman plugins come in. I took the screenshot of Fedora, so Podman itself was actually already installed. We'll kind of hint as to why that is already. But like it's a very small, lightweight kind of setup. And like I said, it's pretty much just a one-to-one replacement. One thing that I learned recently is they actually also have a Podman desktop app, which works exactly like how Docker desktop works. So you can actually go to podmandesktop.io, download it. It will work for Windows, Mac, and Linux. Which, like I said, there's not really a Docker desktop for Linux. So if you kind of want that thing, you don't want to use Portainer or some other tool to be able to manage them on Linux, you can use Podman Desktop. It'll pull it up in the same kind of general interface that the Docker desktop does, and you can manipulate it all through there. If you're on Windows or I will admit I have not tried this on Windows yet, but if you're on Mac OS, it will actually spin up a Linux machine under the back end, just like how Docker does as well, and install everything through there. And again, kind of co-opt that whole kind of Docker workflow process, which is really, really cool. And like I said, it works just like how you would expect. So this was a screenshot of that install. I ran PHP. I didn't actually have it installed. So we just did podman run and then -ti, --rm, PHP bash, which if you're familiar with running things through Docker by hand, that the only difference in that command is the word podman. It downloaded the image, which I had done earlier, so you don't see all the junk on there, but it downloads the exact same images, all that kind of stuff. Works exactly the same thought process. And I ended up with a shell that I could type PHP-v in, and I got 8.2. So they kind of are true to their word when they say just kind of alias Docker to Podman and have it all kind of work. One of the nice things is it actually supports a bunch of additional repositories out of the box as well. We get kind of hung up on this idea that Docker Hub is the place to go to get those images. And it turns out there's a whole plethora of places to get these, not just specifically the the Docker Hub or building them yourselves. There's a whole bunch of them out there that Red Hat keeps track of, Fedora keeps track of, as well as k.io, which is another kind of open source image repository. And those are not governed by Docker. They're not controlled by any one specific place. But Podman supports these things all out of the box. So while the PHP one, it pulled one specifically, I think, from docker.io. In this case, we're trying to pull down the Composer one. It asked me, where do I want to pull that from? Because maybe I don't want the one hosted by Docker, because there is this kind of odd situation where, like, whenever you see like an official release, that may not be the company that actually builds it. For a very, very long time, the MySQL image that was on Docker Hub was not actually maintained by MySQL. Someone else was packaging that up. It was just the one that Docker had decided was the official one. PHP at least was, I don't know if it still is the same way. Someone else was packaging that up, but it was marked as official because Docker had just marked it as official. So if there's places that you want to get your things, your images, you can use those, and it's really easy to set that up. OCI has set up that kind of infrastructure, like I said, and Podman takes advantage of that out of the gate. Now, the only kind of one major thing I find with Docker or with Podman Compose, and Podman is kind of the same way, is because it tries to do things rootless, you sometimes need to have some additional permissions with volume mounting. So you kind of have to give it some extra things to get it to work, especially if you're on Linux and you're using like SC Linux. There's this :Z you'll want to put at the end of your volume paths, which shouldn't affect anybody else doing anything. But this adds a long list of mounting permissions to get things to actually work. So I've got a demo app that we had already set up. The only difference I had to make it to work under Podman Compose was to add that :Z. But it was a little kind of skeleton app we have at Vonage for being able to send an SMS in PHP. Basically, the idea is you download it, you can easily run the PHP dev server and have it working. So all I had to do was add that :Z to the end of it to get it to work properly. So I just, through the normal installation steps, copied our M file over, edited it, and then run Podman Compose up -D. The cool thing I do like about Podman is when you do start all of these things up, it gives you the full command that you can actually see. So, because Podman Compose is just scripting all of these things in the background. So that would be the actual full command if you wanted to run this container itself. There's a whole bunch of extra junk in there that technically work under Docker as well, but we simplified that all down to Podman Compose up. But so that's the actual Podman command that it's running in the background. So it's running my PHP skeleton app. It's doing all the mounting and all that kind of stuff. And in the end, you get a container that works just like how you would expect. So in the end, I can go to localhost 8080, which was the port we had mapped, and I get my application. Side note, as my vendor plug, if you'd like to sign up for Vonage, you can get a coupon for 10 euros on there. It's not going to be up on the screen for super long, but PM me afterwards. I can get you that coupon code. But the whole general idea of Podman and all of this is Docker's not the only thing that's there. You can use these other things that are a replacement, but then also kind of go from there. So if you're thinking about moving away from Docker, Podman's a really good alternative. One, it's rootless and there's no centralized daemon. The Docker system that you install, there's basically an HTTP API behind all of that. When you run the Docker command, that's actually just an HTTP client talking to an API. It's not directly doing anything on the machine. Podman doesn't have to have that. You can run it as your local user with local user privileges. So there is there's less risk of security problems because you can run these things unprivileged, as opposed to Docker, where technically all of those processes are running as the root level. And I'm sure someone in chat may say you can run Docker rootless, which is true. And you can go to the Docker website, there are instructions for doing it, but it was never designed to work that way. And they, for a very long time, resisted the ability to do that. And I think it only took pressure from things like Podman that said, no, you can totally do this, for them to actually do that. The big thing, especially for me, is Red Hat, who maintains the Podman project, is probably a better steward for an open source project than Docker itself is. They have made some, what I would consider pretty serious missteps in their history of being a good open source software steward, for both kind of how they tried to split their proprietary software off into the Moby project, but then didn't really provide a whole lot of support for it. They were doing things like delaying releases. They've gotten better, but for a very long time, it was very hard to get builds for anything other than a very tiny release window that they gave. So you'd only get like LTS releases on Fedora. And you would not get them every single Fedora release, which was really annoying. But I think Red Hat has a better history of maintaining open source projects with a proven track record that I don't think Docker itself really had. But if you do want to try it out, like I said, you can pretty much download it today and immediately start working it. Alias the word Docker to Podman and see how well it works for you. I've switched over to it and I've been using it pretty much exclusively for the last couple of years, except for a few small things where I actually have to have Docker either for demos or things like that where we're specifically using Docker. But it's a really good substitution. Now that's pretty familiar with like how we kind of see things and how we work, as web developers and PHP developers kind of now today. But containers are not solely designed just for web development. We can use them for a whole lot of other things, which kind of leads us to the next part, applications. So containers are actually used today quite readily to distribute applications. And there's three major formats. There's app image, Flatpak, and Snap. All of these take those same ideas that containers have that we're used to, and those same technologies, and then now kind of utilize them in various other ways and solve kind of the Linux application distribution problem that we're kind of running into as more and more people kind of switch to the desktop and want things. But there's Ubuntu, there's Fedora, there's Debian, there's Arch, there's Gentoo, there's all of these Linux distributions, which while they have package managers, that's a lot of duplicated effort to have the same package distributed across multiple distributions. So applications have the same problems that we face as web developers needing to deploy code. So the biggest issue that really has kind of reared its head as things have gotten more and more popular on the Linux side is the dependency problem. Many developers will build software against specific versions of built-in system libraries that may be vastly different from distribution to distribution. This can happen from different LTS releases on Ubuntu to just generally Ubuntu to Fedora to anything else. And we run into problems as developers want to use new technologies, but end users may not have those libraries or older versions of those libraries installed on their machine. The other kind of cool thing is that because of the way containers kind of isolate processes, you can add kind of a sandboxy layer on top of your applications to make things more secure. So you can have a application that only has access to your home directory, and that's it, nothing else on the machine. And because everything can be packaged up into a single kind of distributable bundle in many cases, application distribution becomes a lot easier. Ironically, which was one of the reasons why like AppImage is created. So like I mentioned, there's three main ones that you'll kind of run across on Linux. And I don't think it's kind of the same idea on Mac OS where you've got kind of the .app. But the idea is you generally will have a packaged thing that will run with all the dependencies all kind of built into it. So AppImage is the closest thing to that idea. Simon Peter, the developer for that, really tried to get back to the original idea of I have an exe I want to run that has everything inside of it that I need, that I have a .app application that has everything inside of it that I need. And these are single downloadable files that you double click and you can get them to run automatically. They don't need anything dependent on the system in and of itself, and they fully work. And that's a container. That's all it's really doing, is it's redirecting all of these processes to look inside this compressed file that it brought along. Now, since then, we've had a couple other things that have popped up as well. Probably the most controversial is Snap, developed by Canonical, because Canonical seems to have this not invented here mentality for many things, which is why we had like Unity, and then now we have Snap. But Snap does kind of the same thing. It's a way to distribute these applications in a nice prepackaged format with all of their dependencies all bundled in. The big downside is it's completely controlled by Canonical. It is technically open source, but the only way to get most packages is through the Canonical store. And depending on how things are built, they could be a lot less performant than the other two options. Firefox is usually kind of the go-to example of like pointing at Snap and saying why it's so bad. Turns out that was actually just a build issue for the most part. Snaps probably aren't actually any fundamentally slower than the other two, but it's always something that people like to point out. But it has an advantage of it's specifically designed for distributing applications that are not GUI related. So it's one of the few ways you can actually reliably distribute a CLI application and have it kind of work how a user would expect. Snap is kind of interesting in that the way it integrates with the system, you don't have to know any fancy commands like you would with Flatpak to actually invoke these things. Because Flatpak is kind of a full ecosystem that works a little bit more like a traditional container where you've got layers of things that are downloaded and played with there. But most Flatpak invocations, for example, if you install VS Code, you don't directly usually type .code to get things to work. It's actually running a Flatpak command in the background. Now, Flatpak is actually maintained or managed by Red Hat as well. You're going to see Red Hat pop up a lot in these slides. But this was designed with GUI apps and sandbox first in mind. But again, at the end of the day, this is a container. It's using containers to actually solve the distribution problem of applications. And no matter which of these three that you actually go with, there are tools out there to help you build these things. And if you do have apps that you want to distribute, set them up and distribute to people. And there's whole ecosystems that have flourished around these. And that's to the point where now in Fedora, I think as of 35, Fedora 37 just came out not that long ago, Flatpaks are built in to the system and generally the preferred way of actually doing things. So when you go to the system the software center and go to install anything, Flatpak will probably be the option that it gives you first. RPMs are still there. They're probably never going to go away, but they're built in now because of the security that they offer and kind of the way that things are kind of moving in many circles. Flatpak's now the default option when available, which is really, really cool. For most users, once they actually start it going, it's just an application. there's usually no major difference between the Flatpak or app image, snap version, whatever, once you actually get in there and start using it, with probably some fairly major caveats, which we'll talk about here in a second. But at the end of the day, you end up with an application that's installed, which is not conflicting with anything else, that can be self-updated in many instances, and everything all just kind of works, all thanks to how containers themselves actually function. I will fully admit it's still a little bit rough, as I know going through and building some of these slides the last couple of weeks. The one big thing is you're locked to libraries that come with the image or the container. So if those libraries are out of date, that image is going to be out of date. Many times, depending on the package technology you're using, it may be hard to input new things. OBS is probably the hardest one to mess with. That or VS Code, one of the two, because they can both be pretty annoying to deal with. If you get the wrong build of it. So like if you want to upgrade the version of FFmpeg that OBS uses, that's a lot harder to do inside that container because it's kind of built specifically to run the way it's designed. VS Code is kind of the same way. If you get the Flatpak version of VS Code, it works for most things, but if you want to get the full power of how it actually works, you need to go and install the language libraries from Flatpak and have them integrated into VS Code. So it's not just as simple as install PHP on my machine. Now the Flatpak VS Code can work. In fact, if you install the Flatpak version of VS Code, one of the first files it gives you is a README file with like, hey, here's how you finish setting this up, because you're going to want language applications. You're going to probably want to use your system terminal, because if you pop open the terminal without doing anything, you get the container terminal. You don't get your system terminal. So like they tell you right off the bat, here's some extra work you'll need to do. And the way you fix some of these things is inconsistent between those technologies. So Flatpak has an application called FlatSeal, which you can go in. It's a really nice little GUI app that you can add additional things to it. Works fairly well, but it's really kind of unintuitive if you've never used it before. So one of the problems I ran into with Fedora 37 is they've kind of changed things a little bit with Podman and how you get that into VS Code. Those, for whatever reason, it doesn't work, and I didn't take the time to get it to work. Works fine on Fedora 36, so it's probably something to do with some package changes. But you'd have to go into FlatSeal. You have to add a couple things in to get it to work 100% if you want to have a Flatpak VS Code as well as Podman. And that gets even more doubly complicated if you've got stuff inside other Flatpaks. So it's a little bit rough, but you can definitely see where things are going. For most things, you can download things off of FlatHub, which is the primary repository for Flatpak, install them, and they kind of work. You can use Snap to install stuff. They generally work. At the end of the day, the cool thing is they're actually all powered by containers, but we're to the point now where you're probably not going to notice that they're inside of a container based on how they work. So we've talked a little bit kind of about single process containers, but like I said, there's ways of actually doing an entire system in almost kind of a virtual machine-like way. And the primary tool for that generally is called LXC is the container part of it, but overall it's a system of tools called LXD. So like I said, it's a suite of tools provided by linuxcontainers.org. They're the I guess foundation that maintains the LXD project and all the associated projects with it. Because there's the container project LXC, there's a Fuse file system layer to be able to pull things in and out of these containers. But the idea behind LXD and LXC, and I'll probably just use LXC for the rest of the talk, is that you want to be able to run multiple processes inside of a virtualized environment. More like how an actual virtual machine works, as opposed to how like Docker or even Podman wants you to have one process per thing. So when you want to have a full system, and this is kind of the replacement for like what Vagrant would be if LXC was usable kind of outside the Linux ecosystem, you would have the ability to build these containers and ship them off much more fully and kind of bespokely built than you would with like Docker Compose or Podman Compose. So you can have things like your MySQL server alongside an HTTPD server with PHP FPM, all running in the same containerized sphere. So this is really easy to get set up if you're on Linux. I have not tried this under WSL, but I don't see why it would not work necessarily, but I can't guarantee that it will. But generally, this is used a lot alongside Ubuntu-based software. This is kind of one of the big initiatives that Canonical has also pushed. So it's in the apt repositories. You can install it in there, or Snap, which works just fine. I've always used the Snap install of LXD. It will technically work on other distributions, but generally it tends to be the Debian-based ecosystem that it's used on. Because it is a little bit more full-featured than just a single containerized process, when you go and set it up, it's going to ask you a whole host of questions because it's setting up an entire environment for it to be able to build and run these containers. You could argue that if you install Docker, it's doing Docker or Podman's doing a lot of these things under the hood for you, but LXD has you go through and set these things up. So I generally, unless I'm doing something special and I'm using it, will just use most of the default things other than maybe changing the storage pool size. But it'll go through and ask you a whole bunch of questions like, how do you want your IP set up? Where do you want to store these things at? All that kind of stuff. If you just want to get in and go and use it, you can just do LXD init, just hit enter for everything, and that'll give you a nice usable system. And then it's now to the point where you can easily launch and run these containers just like you could with Docker. So there's a launch command. You give it an operating system to run because generally you're going to take a full fat operating system and run that entire thing. So I want all of Ubuntu. I want all of Fedora. I want all of CentOS, as opposed to a container where we're now using these stripped down, basically sets of libraries like Alpine and things like that. So you're going to say, I want to run this version of Ubuntu and give it a name. So here I've just called it demo container. And then you can execute commands in there. So to get into the container, the normal way is just to execute bash inside of it. And you get a bash container. So we can see I go from the line where I'm doing the sudo exec to I get a brand new prompt saying I'm root at demo container. That looks a lot very familiar to if you're doing a Docker container and you're execing into something else. Same idea, but the idea is with this, you're really kind of expected to start an operating system up, quote unquote, then go in and configure it however you would like. So if you want to have a full dev environment, you would distribute things like this. And you can actually package these things up and then move them around as well. One of the jobs I worked at before, we actually built all of our development environments off of LXC. So whenever we would run builds, we would launch an LXC instance, build everything, install all the dependencies, and then run everything as a clean room build. When we're done, shut it all down. If we wanted development environments, we used LXC to bring all of those things up, and then it had everything inside of there that we needed. The nice alternative to this instead of virtualization is because it's using container technology, you don't have the overhead of virtualization. So I glossed over it really early when I was talking about the skipped how containers work. But basically all containers use the host kernel. So whatever version of the Linux kernel you've got installed, be it Fedora's or Ubuntu's or whatever version number they have it installed, all a container does is route everything through there. It's not virtualizing access to the hardware. It's not virtualizing memory or any of that kind of stuff. It's using the stuff built into that kernel to be able to slice off 8 gigs of memory, 2 gigs of memory, whatever, however much hard drive space. So you can use all of those things and run a bunch of processes through that same group. And that's what LXC does. It just takes all of those things and allows you to run multiple processes inside of there. So if you ever needed what amounts to a full virtual machine, LXD and LXC are probably the best alternative you have nowadays. So generally, like I said, you're going to probably want to use this when you need full environments, because we probably have, like I said, if we think about a traditional web development setup, we've got a database. We probably have some sort of queue management system. We've got a web server running. whatever flavor, if you're running Caddy or Apache or whatever, we're running a language inside of there like PHP and probably FPM mode. But all of those things need to work together. And if you don't need something that needs to scale out, which that's one thing a lot of people forget, is Docker was really designed as a distribution solution, not a development environment solution. This might be a good alternative if you're running kind of a full Linux ecosystem. If you're distributing large applications that need to run all kind of self-inclusive, this is a good alternative to having someone bring up a bunch of containers. If they're going to deploy to a Linux machine anyway, they could use LXC. You could ship them one big thing, start the whole process up, and it works. And things like Proxmox will use this as a lightweight virtualization alternative. So like I actually run Proxmox at home. It's a virtualized clustering system. So I've got 4 machines that just kind of all share a pool of resources and have a bunch of virtual machines, or these LXC containers running inside of them, depending on what I want. So this is kind of a good alternative when you don't want to go through orchestration, but you have the ability to do this. Again, you are still kind of locked into the Linux side because there's not really a cross-platform way of doing it. But if you are in a situation where you can run all Linux from front to back, this is a really good alternative. So kind of going from there, we're going to shift focus to kind of what the future looks like, I think especially for developers as we move on. So one of the things that's built into Fedora nowadays, and that Red Hat is really pushing, is this idea of Toolbox, which is a general system, but it's a tool specifically designed for developers and development environments first. So what Toolbox is a bunch of tools that make it easy to build development environments in a package containerized way, using technology like Podman, because it's actually powered by Podman under the hood, but using a lot of the ideas that LXC has as well. So you're actually kind of encouraged to get multiple things installed and build environments inside of Toolbox to be able to deploy them. And kind of like LXC, and this is kind of like lightweight quote unquote virtualization, it has a really tight integration with the host operating system. So in the little kind of like bumper slide here, I said, what if SCL actually worked? There was this there's an older technology called software collection libraries that Red Hat has pushed for many, many years, which allows you to have separated development environments. It's not quite a container. It's kind of like a mixture of just like some fancy path maneuvering, because it's not doing any sort of process isolation. But this takes that idea of being able to have multiple copies of languages and multiple development environments set up, and makes it work much cleaner with the technologies that we have today. So it does things like automatically integrates with your home folder, automatically integrates with a lot of the devices that are on the machine and kind of passes them through in a way that kind of makes sense for the containers. And I'm kind of glossing over a little bit because it's doing a lot of these like very low level things, but it integrates with your host operating system much more naturally than being in a container. It's much easier to play around with it and live inside this toolbox than it is to like exec into a container and mess around. And a lot of that is because it uses a lot of these OCI technologies and standards to be able to make this kind of work and functionality, to work and function. It's also distribution agnostic. So if you can run Podman, you can run Toolbox. LXC and LXD are, like I said, are generally a little bit more Debian focused in that kind of ecosystem. This is meant to be something that is kind of global and you can install anywhere. And the reason for this is things like SCL sucks. For my day-to-day work, I have upwards of 4 versions of PHP installed at any one time, multiple versions of Node, 2 or 3 versions of Python. I don't know how many versions of Ruby I have installed at this point, because it's like every single Ruby project I work on has a different locked version of Ruby I need to use. But using tools like SCL, which worked back in the day and we kind of put up with, I don't want to have that on my host machine, but also I don't want to have to live inside of a container 100% of the time. Toolbox gives me a nice kind of like middle ground for being able to switch back and forth between those environments, because I can keep everything for those self-contained, and I can run all of them at exactly the same time as well. SCL doesn't allow you to run multiple things in different environments very easily. Toolbox kind of helps do that. And a large reason for that is when we're building development environments, we're usually thinking about them at the system level, not at an individual process level. Yes, I want a specific version of PHP for this project, but I probably also have other things that run alongside that. I don't want to have to maintain a bunch of Docker Compose files if I can just set up my development environment and work the way that I want to work. For all of the touting that I've done over the years of container technologies, I honestly hate working in them day to day. It is so much simpler if I have something bare metal that I can install and start to work with. Toolbox gives me that ability, but also because it's a container, I can package it up and move it to another machine if I want to. And just kind of like with everything else, these tools today have gotten much, much simpler than it used to be. So you can use Toolbox Create, give it an environment. You can actually specify operating system levels. So by default, it grabbed Fedora 37 because that's what I was installed on. But you can specifically say, I want this underlying operating system. There's a whole host of them out there because they're just OCI containers. You can use any kind of underlying one you want. And then you can do the enter the environment name. It drops you to a nice little command line, gives you a little visual indicator that you're inside of it. So not just that the host name itself changed like LXC does, you get a nice little visual indicator. And that actually persists, at least in Fedora, as you go from terminal to terminal. It kind of like sets you all up, puts you in this toolbox, and gets it to work. And the nifty thing is, under the hood, it's literally just a container. If you pull up Podman Desktop and you look at it, it's running a Podman container just with a bunch of extra things already kind of wired up for you, which is really, really cool. So again, I can take that, I can extract it, I can move it to another machine, I can import it in through Podman, boot up that image, and all of my stuff is still there, which is really, really cool. So we're kind of now moving to this idea of we can take large chunks of our day-to-day work and virtualize them. This slide makes another appearance because it's kind of the same idea as like the app ID or the app image and Flatpak things. You're kind of locked whatever libraries that come in the image container, which in this case you actually probably want because you're developing something. You want to make sure that your environment is stuck that way. But that does mean if you have updates you need to do inside that container, you kind of have to do them every single container. So if you have 4 or 5 projects all running PHP, let's say we're on 8.2 and everything goes to 8.3, you need to go into each of those containers and update them. So while it's probably a plus because it's a dev environment, it's a bit of a minus on the maintenance side. Getting things like Visual Studio Code to work properly don't just work out of the box. You have to do a bunch of additional setup to get these things to work. It is a little bit better, but like I said, if you try to take the Flatpak version of VS Code and have a toolbox with all of your stuff inside of it, at least on Fedora 37, I can't get it to work. I'm sure there's someone smarter than me that can actually get it to work, but it didn't work. I worked that way a long time under Fedora 36 and 35. So again, it's probably something simple, but it does take extra work because you have to go into Visual Studio Code. You have to give it access to Podman. You then have to point it to run the toolboxes and do that kind of thing. If you're running regular, like bare metal VS Code, it's a little bit easier because you can just point to it through the fake Docker environment Podman gives you, but it takes additional work. And like I said, being inside of a container could both be a little bit restrictive as well as a little bit freeing, because if I mess up a container, I've messed up that container. I haven't messed up my machine. And I can deal with messing up one project versus messing up every single other project I'm running on my computer. But at the same time, you have those rough edges to where being inside of a container is not the best way to probably be for every single thing that you're doing. And then that kind of leads us to this idea of what Fedora is doing with Silverblue. As we kind of move toward this idea of an immutable operating system. Take everything I talked about with Flatpaks and Toolbox, and that's Fedora Silverblue. You live inside of an ecosystem where the host operating system you cannot and should not touch. You run everything through Flatpaks and you run everything in Toolbox. There are many people that actually do this today fairly well. This idea is also sort of borne out in like Nix OS, which doesn't technically use containers per se, but it's that same idea. We're starting to separate the operating system from our environment, but not in a local remote sort of way. We're using all of those things that containers give us to actually be able to work and live inside this operating system. So the big thing behind it is the immutability of that operating system. We want to make sure that everything stays identical and that you can check it. The biggest problem we have nowadays is things like malware, viruses, all those kind of things. Having the problem of, well, I've got the same version of Ubuntu that you have installed. Why doesn't that work? If we can move the host operating system to be immutable, we can make it easier to push updates because they just become image updates. All of our Flatpaks are maintained by themselves. All of our development environments are self-contained. We could move forward with upgrades in a much safer manner, because if something blows up, you roll back to the old image. You don't have to worry about too much of those things. So with Silverblue, whenever you do like a kernel upgrade, you will actually switch to a new image. And if you don't like it, you switch back to a whole nother image. If you want to try out a new version of the operating system, you swap the underlying image out. When it reboots back up, it overlays all of your Flatpaks, your toolboxes on top of it. So now you're on Fedora 38 or whatever you want to try out. If it doesn't work for you, you roll back to the old one. So all of that power of a container can now be kind of leveraged at the entire operating system level. And I think that's kind of the way we're moving. We see things like the whole idea of sandboxing applications become more and more important. If you're using Mac OS, I mean, when I started this Zoom call, the first thing I had to do was give Zoom permission to my camera, then give Zoom permission to my microphone, then give Zoom permission to share my desktop. It's kind of that same idea with containers. Give it permission to different devices on my machine. Give it permission to be able to talk to my home directory. Give it permission to be able to talk to the root folder on my file system. We're moving toward that ability because containers give us that sandbox security, but then we're taking that whole idea and being able to say, like, again, here's your operating system. It's kind of just a consequence of what you're running. Everything else you live in lives on top of that. Swap out the underlying system whenever you want. In theory, you could say you don't want to run Fedora anymore, flip it to Ubuntu if you want to try it out for a day. No repartitioning, doing any of that kind of stuff, just split the image underneath it. We're not quite to that point, but it probably won't be too long till we're to that point. Now, again, there's rough edges with that. Most applications are not designed to deal with a read-only partition. A lot of the Fedora tools and that kind of ecosystem are moving toward that, but there's all sorts of things where there's just no Flatpaks. I need to install RPMs. So there's hoops you have to jump through to get that to work. Like I said, working inside of a container, even inside Toolbox, can be a bit of a pain, but I think things are going to get better and things are progressing at a rapid pace, as it does with any technology that we do. So I think at the end of the day, what we're looking at is containers are going to be the future. I highly doubt that it's going to be Docker. Docker has kind of pigeonholed itself into this kind of development specific distribution system that they want us to be in. But, you know, the cat's out of the bag. Everybody can now see what containers do for us. And we're leveraging containers in incredibly new and interesting ways. And I think that's where we're going to go. We're going to have this immutability. We're going to have this ability to move things around in containers. And I think it's going to be a lot nicer as things go on. And I say that as someone who has been waiting for the day that it's the year of the Linux desktop. It's been that way for the last 10 years. Maybe one day we'll get there, but if nothing else, we've got containers that we can use and hopefully split out to the rest of the world and show how all that kind of stuff works. So with that, thank you. If anybody's got any questions, I'll take those. If you want to reach out to me, I'm a senior developer advocate at Vonage. So if you got communications needs, come talk to me. Wasn't the purpose of this talk, but come reach out to me. Or if you want that coupon code, DM me on Twitter or get me on Mastodon. I've got both Twitter and Mastodon links there. So you've got me, you've got my cat who is sleeping on her bed. And then we also have an elephant. So if you want to find out how to get an elephant, which was on that same bed, maybe not the specific one that was on the cat bed, talk to me and we might be able to get you an elephant if we can do some things. But otherwise, I would be happy to take any questions anybody has. I was not watching chat, so if anybody knows any things that wasn't chat, feel free to let me know and I'll see what I can answer.
I posted a question actually. So my question was, as far as one of the things that Docker that is nice about Docker is Docker Hub, and the ability to be able to get lots of different containers that other people have built, and we don't have to build them because we just download them and use them and that kind of thing. Does Podman or is there an alternative to that?
Yeah, so probably the most popular is K.io. It's KAY.io. They have a lot of alternative containers. I think it's spelled KUAY.io. They are kind of like an open source version of what Docker Hub is. Fedora and Red Hat also keep track of their own containers. So you can actually go to anybody that has basically what amounts to a Docker repository setup, point Podman at that, and be able to pull down from there. I generally probably nowadays use most of the things off of K.io, unless it's only on the Docker Hub. The cool thing is if you are kind of in that Red Hat ecosystem and you want things built specifically with the Fedora libraries, that's where the Red Hat and Fedora repositories kick in. But otherwise, you can technically point it at any compatible repository. K.io just tends to be the most popular out of those. In worst case, you can continue to use Docker Hub. Nothing says you can't use it. It just gives you those alternatives.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
All right. Yep. I think we'll hopefully get some questions here in on YouTube. So definitely get some questions in for Chris if you have them. I have a couple. So you mentioned Proxmox. I watched a few YouTube videos on it. It seems pretty cool. Can you talk a little bit about Proxmox and using it for things like your local home lab kind of setup?
Sure. Yeah. So so basically what Proxmox is it's a way of clustering machines together as well as a hypervisor for doing all of that. So I basically have two. They're kind of like Intel NUC ripoffs made by Zotac. They're like really tiny. They're like little 4-core Intel Atom machines, as well as a couple just like old machines that like my kids have outgrown and things like that. You can install Proxmox on there and basically have them all kind of coordinate and share drives and that kind of stuff. So like it's backed by like my NAS for a bunch of the storage. But it gives you kind of the web interface for being able to build virtual machines or LT containers and manage them and maintain them, and even do things like hot migrations or cold migrations between different machines. If I know I'm going to turn one of the nodes off, I can move that over. So like currently right now on that, I run like my Pi-hole DNS filtering. I have a WireGuard VPN set up on it. I've got a remote Linux machine for being able to test Linux specific stuff because I'm mostly on macOS nowadays, as well as desktop tests for being able to do screenshots in different operating systems. So like I've got a Windows 10 and a Windows 11 VM all set up on there. It all runs remotely on that hardware because most of my machines nowadays are multi-core machines with like gigs of memory in them. So that's a really good way to offload that from my machine and kind of run those things specifically on there. The only thing I don't have on there that I probably should is my Home Assistant stuff. But mostly that's because I have a USB controller and it's a bit of a pain to pass those things through in Proxmox. But one of the cool things is like with this, it actually uses LXC and kind of pushes you that way. If you don't need a whole VM, spin up an LXC container and then have everything, be able to migrate using the LXC containers.
So follow-up question, do you have your kids using VMs on Proxmox?
No.
No Windows stuff? Okay.
No. Ironically, Pi-hole has been the best thing I have ever done because it has cut out so many ads that would deliver junk through them. My kids are pretty good at being safe on the internet, but that doesn't stop malware and stuff coming in through like ads. Just cutting out the ads fixed a lot of those problems. You can do things in there. Many people who actually will run full virtualized environments on them. My hardware is not that good to be able to have 3 people on it at one time, but it's good enough to have like a couple Linux machines and spin up a Windows VM when I need it and not have to worry too much about it.
Awesome. Okay, second question. So any issues to using Podman and OCI compliant images inside Kubernetes? Have you run into any issues?
No, because basically what's going to happen with Kubernetes is it's going to run itself. So as long as the container is OCI compliant, whatever you build and use in Podman should also run in Kubernetes. Because Kubernetes doesn't even actually support Docker anymore, I don't think, or at least they're moving away from doing it. So they are OCI compliant. They're not Docker compliant. So as long as the container is OCI compliant, it'll work in Podman, it'll work in Kubernetes. So if you build it in one, you should be able to push, if you build it locally, it works in Podman, it should work just fine being pushed up to Kubernetes.
Cool. All right.
I have a question for you, and that's with Bitbucket pipelines and GitHub. I can't think of what their pipeline equivalent is called.
Oh, GitHub Actions.
Yes, GitHub Actions. A lot of them allow you to use Docker containers, or Docker images for running things on. Is there do you know of a way of doing that with pipelines or actions using Podman or something that is outside of the very specific Docker infrastructure?
Not really. It's something I haven't tried, so I can definitely look into that. I think for Bitbucket, you should be able to give like a fully qualified address for like a container on like k.io and have it pulled in because it doesn't require authentication or anything like that. But the only restriction would be if those platforms just don't allow you to do it. I don't think GitHub Actions allows you to specify it like that.
Okay.
Maybe if you have the hosted enterprise version, but I think that they just lock themselves to Docker Hub. And again, that's still perfectly fine for a lot of people. I'm not saying don't use the Docker Hub images. And in most case, a lot of these containers are just duplicated between the different repositories. So if you're happy with the Docker Hub images, feel free to continue to use those. They're just regular containers at the end of the day.
Sure.
So
thank you.
Hopefully YouTube is caught up. Sometimes they're behind a little bit it's hard to tell like how far YouTube is behind, but any other questions? Everybody, a Docker Podman container expert now? Are we all gonna go install Podman and start building stuff in containers?
I got a question for you, Chris.
Sure.
By the way, in the chat, we got a lot of praise for your presentation. So great job. So my question basically is, I kind of live and breathe Docker, I guess in the sense of Docker Compose and those sorts of tool sets. And a lot of these tools that you showed, like Toolbox and stuff, are compelling. Even Silver Bullet sounds really cool. But is there a compelling reason to start to try to move to this stuff now? Or is this something that I should keep an eye on and will mature to the point to where we can safely move over without disrupting developer operations too much?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you can do, kind of like I said out of the gate, is maybe just look at switching to Podman. I think you are pretty safe, like I said, swapping those two things out, unless you're deeply embedded in like the Docker Enterprise or like some of their backplane stuff that they have. I don't think there's a good replacement for that. But if you're someone who's just like, I use Docker Compose to build all of my stuff, or we're pushing those up to like a Kubernetes cluster or whatever, you could probably just swap to Podman, see how well it works. If it turns out it doesn't work for your workflow because too many things are Docker dependent, switch back. I don't think necessarily that Docker is probably going to go away anytime soon. I think what we're going to see is, it's a commercial company. It's a piece of software backed, open source software backed by a commercial company. So they tend to keep a very tight grip on it, and historically they have. They do take contributions and things like that, but I kind of foresee that as things move away from them and they take less and less precedence, we'll probably start to move these alternative ones. I would say, if nothing else, it's a good idea to look. I am one who does not like vendor lock-in. So anytime that there's an option that you might be able to move to something with very little friction, take a look at it. Even if it's something to where just as simple as have one person run Podman for a week if you've got the time, see if they run into any issues, keep everybody else on Docker. Most of my coworkers probably don't even know I'm running Podman in many cases, because for the most part, we're all using the same files on the back end. So I think what you're going to see is probably a gradual decline and move away from Docker over time. I don't think it's going to happen in the next year, maybe not the next couple of years, but I think it's always important to keep an open mind because vendor lock-in is such a problem in the technology space. We should be open to alternatives and we should be looking at those things just the same way we look forward to what's the new version of PHP. You know, there's things coming out in PHP, what's going to be 8.3, that are going to be exciting. 8.2 was a really nice release. I've been really happy with it. But at the same time, I want to know what's coming up. I want to know what my alternatives are. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm stuck on PHP 5.6 because we still have customers. I've pulled up the graphs. We have a lot of customers still on 5.6. I don't know why. I'm sure they have their reasons, but that's kind of that you're stuck thing. That's a form of vendor lock-in when you get stuck there, because I'm sure it's probably an operating system thing, something like that. I don't like being stuck in that position, so I'm always exploring new alternatives. I would say give it a shot. You probably aren't going to go the LXC route, because like I said, that's a little bit more restrictive. I would say maybe look at Silverblue. I can't do it. I've tried. It's too restrictive for the way I work day to day, but it's an interesting concept to look at and be like, could I actually live that way? You know, maybe install it in a virtual machine, try to work that way for a week and just see how it goes. I think we will move toward that over time, just because for a lot of security reasons, it makes a lot of sense. But just play with it. Again, download Podman Desktop, turn off Docker Desktop for a week, see how it works.
Okay. And how does that compare to like Rancher Desktop? I've been nudged by somebody before about that one.
I've not used Rancher Desktop. I've mostly just used their server backend stuff as kind of like a Kubernetes, like a lightweight Kubernetes thing. So I wouldn't be able to speak directly to that.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Are there caveats too with running Podman, like weird inconsistencies with certain Docker images or anything that may run differently, or is it all pretty consistent?
Yeah, if you have any containers that specifically rely on the Docker socket and some specific privileges to run, you may run into some weird inconsistencies, because again, like Podman's designed to be run rootless, not necessarily have a backend server. So you would actually have to turn on the Podman server. I think it's called Podman Remote, to actually build up to bring up that HTTP API that other tools expect. Like I said, with the file permissions, the way it mounts things is slightly different than how Docker does, because Docker is running at the root level all of the time, so it's able to mount those things as a root level user, where Podman generally isn't. So that's where, like, most of the time, the fix for me is to go in and add :z, which fixes a bunch. It's a shortcut for a bunch of mounting permissions on Linux to get it to work properly. So you'll sometimes run into weird little things like that. For the most part, fixing them is probably just a Google search away, and like a 5-minute fix or like a small config difference. There hasn't been anything I've run into in probably the last year or so where it's been like, I can't use this. The biggest thing, like I said, was when Laravel started shipping Vite as a Docker container. That was just horribly broken. And I will put most of the blame on that on Podman, because it starts things differently than Docker does. That's pretty much resulted. Probably no action specifically on Laravel's part to fix it for Podman. Podman has probably just gotten better. The container that Vite's probably using is probably a little bit more OCI compliant. So things have gotten better over time. So usually it's a small fix nowadays if I run into anything at all. But like I said, I regularly run Podman, and probably no one even notices I'm on Podman versus Docker for like collaboration tools.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, I'll give it a shot on my Mac. I do have some coworkers that run Windows, and it looks like it's supported there too. So that's good to see. Thank you.
Yeah, all it does is build a VM in the background. If you go into Podman Desktop, there's a section kind of like for Docker Desktop where you can specify like how much RAM it has, how much CPU it uses, all that kind of stuff. So
Sweet. Thanks, man.
okay, if there aren't any other questions, thank you all for having me. Again, my contact info is up there if anybody does have any questions afterwards, or like I said, they wanted to get that coupon code, or we will be at PHP Tech. I'll be there that entire week talking to people, so I might have some elephants with me. If you're going to PHP UK, my coworker Jim Seconde and Chuck Reeves are going to be out there as well. They may have elephants too, so if you're flying out to London, enjoy PHP UK. It's a great conference, but you might be able to snag one there. Otherwise, talk to me. I'll see what we can do. Thank you, everybody.
Just tell them that you already promised me one.
Yes, I have promised people a couple so far. So I need to get more shipped to me because there's very few in the US so far.
Make him pay.
Yeah.
he will gladly hand you money.
Thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate your talk.
Thanks.
Really good.
Thank you very much, Chris. Learned quite a bit.
I don't have anything else but awkward silence at this point. So.
Yeah.
And we need like a clap track at the end of these.
Yeah.
Yeah, now's the part in the talk where we just stare at each other.
Yeah.
I miss the days of an actual user group where like you would just mill around for pizza and then.
Well, I'll say that I'm actually excited about switching over to that because rootless Docker on Linux just never worked.
Nope.
And typing sudo composer Docker up, yeah, not fun.
Definitely seems like a better way to do it and work, use it locally. So, and not too many downsides.
Yeah, like I said, the rootless Docker is a very much a shoehorn way of getting it to work because they spent a very long time saying it one was impossible when it wasn't, but also was like, no, it'll cause too many problems.
Yeah, I've got a side project that its database is running SQL Server, and I'm on a Mac, so I need to set up a container to do that. And I was going to use Docker, but now I might try Podman.
Oh, good luck.
No, thank you.
Should we use your affiliate code, Chris, for every Podman install so you can get an elephant for every time we install it?
I don't even know if they have an affiliate code. Download it, tell them I sent you, and then we'll see what happens.
They'll send him a pod that he can like live in as a hyperbaric chamber or something.
I mean, if they want to send me some Red Hat swag, I wouldn't say no to that.
Thank you for sharing the new PHP Tech code.
Yeah, it doesn't work with two messages. So yep, I almost forgot, but I'm gonna post two messages here. So there is the updated links for speaker sign up if you're interested in speaking for Merge. The first one there, mphp.io/speakers, and then the discount code for PHP Tech is there as well. So we'll get that all updated on our announcements for next month. And apologies about broken links that going to the wrong place. that was my bad. Switched to a new link shortener tool, kind of a collaborative thing that we can all use. And it's still in beta, so there's a little bit of a snag there on some of the links, getting them imported over to the new tool. So, but yes, thank you so much, Chris. I'll wrap things up here. Really appreciate the talk. Definitely learned some things. Excited about trying out Podman, and I really need to work on that home lab. So, this will be more fun stuff to try out. Thank you everyone for joining us in YouTube. I'm hopeful that you enjoyed the talk. We've got some more exciting talks lined up for 2023. So stay tuned for announcements. We'll send out some emails and announce on social media here soon. Thanks for joining us, and hope you guys have a good rest of your February.
Thanks.
Here.
Bye, everybody.
Everyone.